Hey everyone, welcome to this is week 2 of our summer session, and this week we are looking at rhetoric as symbolic action and identification, which really means we're looking at the work of Kenneth Burke. So last week, talking about rhetoric as persuasion and argumentation, we kind of focused a little bit on the two major, or the kind of the legacy, I guess, of two major figures in the 20th century, Stephen Toulmin and Chaim Perelman, and the kind of revitalized approach to thinking about argumentation as more rhetorical that really kicked in the kind of middle part of the 20th century, thanks largely to those two figures. And then Brock Reedy came along after and kind of continued to push it, and many others and so on. Somewhat concurrently, in fact, even prior to the work of Perelman and Toulmin, Kenneth Burke was starting to get active in the early decades of the 20th century. Published his first stuff in like the late teens, in the 20s, 30s. He started to really cook. 40s and 50s, he was very active writing some of his major works. Dude wrote from the literally like 1920s to 1980s. So it's hard to sort of say there was like a Burkean kind of moment to the 20th century because he covered most of it, frankly. So he kind of preceded and then exceeded the work of these argumentation scholars. And so I see them as kind of splintering a little bit because there was still a lot of work, and still is to this day, in argumentation as rhetorical. There's a journal called Argumentation and Advocacy, which is quite rhetorical in its orientation. It's not that hard logic stuff that we talked about before. And then, the kind of Burkean trajectory really kind of went off in a quite different direction, and we're kind of more tracking that Burkean trajectory as we proceed, especially as we get into like the last few weeks of this class. All right, so this week, this reading is Hallsby's chapter on symbols. So instead of like assigning a bunch of Kenneth Burke, which is really hard, I have assigned one little piece by Kenneth Burke. It's probably the easiest that I know of to teach to students who haven't really encountered much Kenneth Burke. So the rest of it we're going to get through the Hallsby chapter. But I'm going to basically skip over almost everything that's not Burke, because there's a lot of stuff in here, and it's good, but it's the stuff on like signs and like the reference and the signified and so on. That to me is like, that's a little bit later kind of stuff. So let's just focus mostly on Burke and this idea of symbolic action. And identification is really important to that. But this idea of symbolic action is, for Burke, language is not just words, but it is also symbols. Because words are symbols, right? Like you're looking at the page here, there's all these little squiggles that symbolize things that we understand as words with meanings and so on, right? But Burke took a pretty broad approach to this idea of language and symbolic action. He was interested in music. He was actually a music reviewer critic early on in his career. He ended up writing poems and even I think he published a novel. So this was a very literary and aesthetically minded guy in terms of the stuff he wrote about, but also the stuff he produced, apart from his more kind of philosophical writings. And his whole thing was that language is action. Rhetoric is about language is about action. So to understand the ways that language compels action and is itself a form of action, right? Kenneth Burke was always also really interested in motives and motivation, and how it is that kind of language and motivation are kind of like language and psychology, right? Like thinking about language as this thing we all use, and then motive is how I am compelled in and through language, right? And so the symbolic dimension of language, if we expand it out beyond just words, is really important, right? Think about images, think about slogans, those golden arches you see from the highway, right? I cannot tell you how important it was for me. I spent some time years ago traveling around China with some colleagues, and we went to some pretty rough, remote areas where, we're all American Western coffee drinkers. Academics are pretty much all coffee drinkers. And, we would go days without any coffee and, eating things that were fascinating, but a little bit like terrifying, and you know, you're way out of your comfort zone. I cannot tell you how important it became to us to see the Starbucks logo. There's a Starbucks, ah! And it wasn't so much that the coffee's great or that the food is great. It was like you get Wi-Fi, you get some familiar coffee, you get some familiar pastries and so on, and it just meant so much, right? So the way that the symbol create the motive, right, that compels the action. You see the logo and you're literally running for it. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about this week. So we're moving beyond persuasion and argumentation, which is a little bit more confined, a little bit more kind of regimented, more specific, right? Now we're thinking about this world of the symbolic. Now I tend to think about like oral speech is, you know, very direct and immediate. It's like talking to each other. Move out from that and you've got words, like written language. And that kind of covers a lot of ground. You've got libraries and you've got, you know, letters and the whole world of language and text. But you can expand beyond that to include things like shapes and images and graphics and even objects and logos and colors and all the rest of it, right? Then you know, all that stuff still functions as symbols. You think about a stop sign, colors, stop lights, colors, right? So you think about how much of this stuff is invented by us. This is our kind of creation, communication creation, right? These symbols, these images, these colors. We're using a lot of things that surround us to create meaning and to create structure and order. And Burke sees that as action and therefore as rhetorical, right? And so with Kenneth Burke, rhetoric really goes big in the 20th century. We go, you know, you think back to the ancient context, it was literally that first thing I was talking about. It was like oral speech, right? Pleading in public in front of a jury of your peers or a few, you know, couple dozen or 100 people who, you know, you want to win over for political office or whatever, or you're pleading your case or you're trying to win. But it's pretty confined, it's pretty immediate, and it's all kind of happening right here. And then in the 20th century, with all the, you know, mass media, when you've got all these new kind of mediation technologies, you have a more complex population, you have more ways of reaching them in more ways with language and communication and symbols and so on. So things just start to get a lot more crowded and involving, you know, and rhetorically speaking. So the journey of rhetoric over the 20th century was more complex, more finding its expression in more kind of tucked away places. We're no longer talking about just political speech. We're talking about the written word. We're talking about narratives. We're talking about, you know, Burke wrote about music and theater and arts and literature as rhetorical. In fact, the other piece we're reading this week in the second week is his short essay, Literature as Equipment for Living, right? And so literature as equipment for living, right there you get that sense of action. Equipment helps you do things, right? And so literature for Burke is something that consoles. You think about it like a greeting card or a consolation card. You go to some occasion, you go get a card and you hand it to someone. And that's a very rhetorical gesture of like, here, I'm trying to help you in some way with this little sentiment, right? That's the kind of stuff we're talking about this week. So let me dive into this chapter, which is pretty involved. So we got some concepts like identification, terministic scream. Don't know if I'm going to get too much into dramatism, demagoguery. Wow. So I like what he says at the very beginning about the symbol. Where is that? Yeah, what are symbols? The concept of the symbol comes from ancient Greek word symbolon, which is the union of the words thrown and together. The ancient use of the word symbol had an important social function. They were objects that represented a pact, treaty, or agreement between people and the state. This thing represents that human action, that human behavior, right? And there's this kind of agreement as well. Like we all kind of acknowledge that this thing stands for that thing. And it's this kind of consensual thing. Like, yes, that is the case. Receiving a symbolon was more than receiving a gift or a token. They indicated the presence of a specific relationship between an individual and institution. So that's good. So the point is, like, symbols are these things that stand in for other things, and they're important and they're valuable and they're the product of agreement or consensus or some kind of social collective usage, right? We don't all vote on words. We don't all sign off on the dictionary, but it's more about kind of this normative practice of just using things and picking them up and next thing you know, it's in use. Language is always evolving. It's always encountering new terms, new words, new phrasings, right? And that is as it should be. And so things come and go. A dictionary is really a kind of a portrait of a certain kind of life history of certain terms, but things are always evolving. And so, therefore, rhetoric and the action of symbolism is always evolving as well. And so, Kenneth Burke and identification through rhetoric here is important. So as I mentioned, for Burke, language is a form of symbolic action, right? Stop, go, you're married, it's a boy, right? It's a girl. I do, I don't, I promise, I will, I trust, I care. Like how much of like ourselves are carried forth in language and promises and threats and all the rest of it. So, the language action part I think makes a ton of sense. And then we get into this business of identification, which, for Burke, it's a highly symbolic phenomenon or process. You think about the politician who's giving a speech at a factory, wearing the hard helmet and the safety vest and the boots or whatever, and always that like, my grandfather worked in a mill, that's identification. And both of those examples of wearing the hat, you don't have to say anything if you put on the hat. You are attempting to identify with an audience or with a group or with an other, right? And so a lot of this stuff works very subtly. When you when you're wearing a Las Vegas Golden Knights jersey, and yeah, we're the champs, and you go to another city and someone sees you wearing it, like, yo, bro, woo, right? Like identification. You don't have to say much more beyond that. It's like, oh yeah, you're a Vegas, I'm Vegas, right? So this stuff happens so kind of diffusely and so, all the time. The ways that we identify through the clothes we wear, through the, cars we drive, through the stores we shop at. And we align ourselves symbolically with each other, with institutions, with images and narratives and ideas of things and the good life and so on, right? That's all identification. So it's symbolic, and it is about kind of aligning ourselves with others. For Burke, there's always a kind of inverse to the things he talks about. There's always a kind of flip side, a dialectic. And so for identification, we can also talk about division. So identification gone wrong or bad identification is division, right? And so Burke would say, my two favorite teams are the Golden Knights and whoever's playing, I don't know, who's our worst rival? Is it San Jose, the Sharks or whatever? So it's like every, there's an identification, and by implication, we are not identifying with that and that and that and that kind of idea, right? And so division and identification are kind of like flip sides of the same phenomenon. The point is that these things are all happening kind of oftentimes quietly, even unconsciously for the most part, and symbolically. And it doesn't have to involve words. It can involve words. I think of words, like oral speech, written speech, and then the symbolic is much bigger kind of realm. It includes language, it includes words and speech, but it's bigger and bigger, right? And so a lot of stuff's going on here, and fashion and things we buy and consume, and again, where we dine, or who we our favorite director, our favorite artists, musicians, and so on and so on and so on. So much of this is that symbolic action, identification, and also like division. Again, oh, you like Taylor Swift? Well, I'm over here with, I don't know, Katy Perry, right? Like identification, division are these kind of like co-present kind of dynamics. How am I doing here? 13. Oh boy. So along with identification is we have this business of consubstantiality. I talked about in previous videos the importance for persuasion of common ground, of being on the same side. This is the idea of consubstantial, which is shared substance. We are sharing the same ground. We are on the same ground. So we have something in common. So much of identification is this idea of like, we have something in common. You and I agree on this, or we are alike in these ways. Maybe not always, but we're lining up here, right? And that is consubstantiality. It's a great concept. Skip over the Gonzalez stuff. By all means, take a look at that. Mitt Romney, skippity skip. I'm going to skip over all this kind of philosophy of language stuff by Pierce. And the signifier, signified and referent, is pretty useful, but still that second order stuff, as far as I'm concerned, icon, index, and symbol, again, interesting, second order. I need to get to the other stuff on Burke. Propaganda, also important, skip over. I just want to kind of get the baseline concepts on symbolic action. But this stuff by like Bernays and Walter Lippmann, all really good and interesting stuff. All right, so part 2, rhetoric as symbolic action. So I got to kind of try to do this in about less than 10 minutes. And this is more Burke, right? So symbolic action describes the construction of social reality through symbols that foster identification. Sounds good. Let's place some firm definitions on this terminology. Symbolic action describes the making or construction of social reality through symbols that foster identification. It is expressive human action, the rhetorical mobilization of symbols to act in the world, right? And also symbols are themselves a kind of action, right? So the very speaking of things, the very uttering of certain words, like go get 'em or whatever, can really sort of change reality. Rhetoric is the use of symbolic action by human beings to share ideas, enabling the work together, cooperation. Yeah. Rhetor, symbol, verbal symbols, visual symbols, identification. All right, so he's actually talking about the definition of man, which I do assign to my advanced 409 students. In fact, they write a paper on this essay. It's, I think, one of Kenneth Burke's best essays, this definition of man. We won't go too deep into it, but he's got these 5 clauses. He's like, what does it mean to be man? Now, for Burke, again, he's interested in communication and rhetoric and social behavior. So his definition of man is sort of in that sense, right? Man as a like social creature, as a communicative creature. There's are these kind of dimensions to how he wants to think about man as like, subject of language. So inventor of the negative is a really interesting one. Language and symbols allow us to sort of talk about negatives. And for Burke, the negative is really the realm of like judgment, of critique, of saying no, right? This idea of no, or thou shalt not, or that is bad, or do not, or stay away, right? This idea of the negative, he says, doesn't exist in nature. It's purely a kind of linguistic and symbolic function. I think about offense a lot of times when I think about the concept of the negative. If you think about a gated community, right? It is a literal, physical kind of symbol of no. Right? And that's not really something that exists in nature. Maybe territoriality could be sort of like that, but it's not symbolic. It's just do not cross this line or you're dead kind of thing, right? So we create symbols, we create doors and gates, and sometimes we do it with even less literal kinds of examples, and maybe it's language itself, or it's the way we kind of engage and talk and we speak in codes, and that can be also a form of like stay away, right? So the inventor of the negative is a really interesting phenomenon. Separated by their natural conditions by instruments of their own making, right? So even tools and equipment, these things are packed with symbols. I think about cars, I think about highways, where I always feel like separated from my natural self when I'm like stuck in traffic. And so much of this stuff is like technological and symbolic. We're going to the job to fulfill our duties and to live our dreams, and so much of this stuff is like propped up by symbols. Goaded by a spirit of hierarchy and rotten with perfection, I think, are the 2 most important ones of this definition. This idea of goaded by a spirit of hierarchy is, Burke says, we are basically like hierarchical beings in the sense that we're always obsessed with like up and down, right? Like I got to get higher up, I'm too far down, or oh, he's no good, he's down, or like, oh, such a snob, they're way up there. You want that promotion, you want that raise, you want to live in the better part of town, you want to drive a nicer car, you want to wear cooler clothes. Goaded by hierarchy, more, better, superior, up, better than down, right? That's pretty wild. And for Burke, all of this is like highly, highly symbolic. It's about images and narratives and stories and fantasies about, up. Even up itself is a kind of symbol, right? Finally, rotten with perfection is very similar in the sense that, this pursuit, this being goaded by hierarchy, oftentimes the notion of up is very similar to the notion of the pure or the perfect or the best or the ultimate, right? But think about how destructive obsessions can be. Obsession to make the perfect this or that. That movie Black Swan comes to mind with Natalie Portman, right? She's so obsessed with playing this part that she just like destroys herself in the process. I think about what some enterprises who want to, I don't know, maybe even things like Facebook and Google, we want perfect data, we want perfect information. Well, you're ravaging our brains in the process, right? And so be careful about these pursuits. For Burke, he doesn't actually say if this is part of our natural being or if this is part of our merely symbolic being. For him, it's kind of both. We are both. He says we are symbol using and symbol misusing animals, right? So for Burke, we are animals, but we have these higher order complex language and symbols using abilities. And they get us into all kinds of trouble when you think about the penthouse, when you think about, living in that community versus that community. It's all around us. It's highly symbolic. Go ahead and take a look at Martha Solomon. I believe that is Martha Solomon Watson, who is actually the dean of our college at UNLV. She hired me when I was hired here. She was the dean, and that's cool that she's being talked about here. Deterministic screen is a really cool Burkean concept. This is a separate essay all on its own. Do I want us to do this? Maybe that's the last thing before drama. I don't think I want to do dramatism. So deterministic screen is this idea that we are linguistic creatures, and our languages kind of influence our thoughts and shape our perceptions, right? And so if you're born in that part of the world, you might speak a certain way, use certain terminologies, have certain reference points. There's this classic example of the Eskimo have how many words for snow, right? Or like people who live in the desert, however many words for sand. The whole is point is you where you are informs your use of language and what matters and your reference points and what words exist and why they exist, right? The point is that in the kind of developing of our linguistic abilities and our social linguistic abilities, we develop these deterministic screens, which are kind of like glasses that we put on, right? And so language can inform our perception, and that perception then actually informs how we encounter the world, right? So he talks here about how symbols distort reality or create a partial lens to interpret the world. It's connected to the idea from Burke's definition. The deterministic screen using the trio of terms reflection, selection, and deflection. This is good. Humans seek for vocabularies that will be faithful reflections of reality. To this end, they must develop vocabularies that are selections of reality, right? So these are human-driven processes. There's a new phenomenon. We have to give it a name. It's never going to be a perfect reflection. There's too much flux in the world, right? So we have to select some language to align with some selected aspect of reality. And in that very selective process, we are also deflecting. This is similar to the identification, which is deflecting away from other possibilities, right? So I'm aligning myself with Golden Knights fans, thereby I am deflecting away from all the other teams kind of idea, right? And so language reflects reality, language then selects reality, finally language deflects reality. And deterministic screens are doing this all the time. When we emphasize certain kind of terms and certain kinds of ways of seeing and thinking about things, we are necessarily not seeing other things. It's a kind of a blindness, right? And so deterministic screen is really interesting because it's sort of how language and perception and psychology loop back on themselves, right? So language informs our thoughts and perceptions, and then our thoughts and perceptions shape how we engage others and use language, and on and on and on, right? And it comes in, it goes out, it comes in, it goes out. And that's 4 features of scientific, so that's deterministic screen. Dramatism is Kenneth Burke's kind of big contribution to the kind of philosophy of society thought about symbolically. But he talks about, this idea of dramatism as agent, thinking about life as a drama, right? There's agents, there's scenes, there's agency, there's sorry, I'm missing agent, act, right? Act, agency, scene, and purpose, right? So we can talk about like a political campaign through a dramatistic lens. We can talk about the act, we can talk about the agency. I'm not going to get super bogged down in that because I've already covered a fair amount of like pretty juicy stuff, and this is quite a bit more complex than I have time to get into. So I think we're actually pretty good. Demagoguery is really interesting. You think about some of the political stuff that's going on right now. We have a lot of demagoguery, which is about charm, thinking about arguers as lovers. It's about seduction and that kind of rape kind of stuff. But again, we don't want to bother with that too much. So that should do 24 minutes. Another 24-ish minute video is fine, I guess. So that's the first 2 weeks of this class. There is a previous video that I've created for Burke's Literature as Equipment for Living reading, so that's already linked. So this now covers the first 2 weeks of our session together, content-wise, video content-wise. I still need to create the first couple of paper prompts, but I'll do that as I'm traveling. That doesn't require my recording studio here. So there you go, gang. Hope we're off to a decent start in the first few weeks. And as I mentioned in my first video, if you're having any struggles or questions or whatever, by all means reach out. I'm happy to chat. The paper assignments, the discovery papers will be about kind of, hooking into some of these concepts and trying to engage with phenomenon and examples that are happening out there in our world. So try to put your rhetorical kind of hat on and your kind of try to spot these things and try to think about where you're seeing them and how they're coming at you. And you'll be in good shape. All right. Hope all is well and see you soon.